Welcome to Jackie's Proof Animals Have Souls and Psychics show, produced through Passionate World Talk Radio, a subsidiary of Global Media Network. This is the 18th show. If you've listened to my show before, you will know I'm a psychical researcher, spiritual historian, lecturer, and decades-long vegetarian for compassionate reasons. An author of 3 books, Proof Animals Have Souls, 500 plus celebrities go vegetarian, and Moses and Jesus the Shamans, mediums. Listeners will come to realise I'm passionate about compassion and respect for all animals, including the human animal, and also my long-standing research into shamanic, out-of-body and near-death experiences and mediumship. For me, both the evidence of survival through mediumship and near-death experiences accounts not only provide some of the best evidence for after-death survival for all beings, but also provide details regarding the after-death landscapes that appear to be responsive to and shaped by predominant thought patterns. My 2 books in my Proof Animals Have Souls series is Proof Animals Have Souls and 500 plus celebrities go vegetarian, and they can be read independently. And the 3rd book is Moses and Jesus the Shamans. They're paperbacks and ebooks. And if you click on my website, JackieJonesHunt.com, then it will take you to the Amazon links. And Jackie is spelt with a Jack with an IE. Today, I'd like to welcome medium Joanne Ward to this 18th show. Joanne lives in Helensburgh, Scotland. She has 2 young daughters and worked as a nurse with a postgraduate qualification in palliative care for 16 years. She worked in prestigious Scottish hospitals, and as I lived in Scotland, in Glasgow, for many years, I know these hospitals very well. Interestingly, when I contacted Joanne for this interview, she said she'd received my full name and the name of one of my books repeatedly for the last 3 to 4 years when she was meditating. So that's fascinating. And Joanne gives 1-to-1 readings, and she works in spiritualist churches and has done so for the last 17 years. Joanne can be contacted on joanneward1979@outlook.com, and further contact details for Joanne and myself will be on today's blog. And Joanne is JOANNE Ward, WARD 1979@outlook.com. So welcome, Joanne. I'm pleased to have you on the show today.
Thank you, Jackie. It's an absolute pleasure to be here and take part in your psychic radio show.
Thank you. The first question I'd like to ask, just so listeners can understand how you work, clairvoyance is seeing and clairaudience is hearing and claircognizance is knowing and clairsentience is sensing. Would you say you are some or all of these as a medium?
Well, Jackie, I'm glad you've asked that question because it's something that students of mediumship get themselves all mixed up about. And for me, when I first began on my mediumship development, I used to get quite upset because the tradition is in circles that everyone meditates together and then after the meditation give feedback to the tutor. And I used to listen to everyone talking about what they'd experienced during their meditation, and they were describing all the wonderful things that they could see while they were meditating, and sometimes that involved spirits or guides. And I used to get quite worried because I didn't see anything other than the inside of my eyelids, to be honest. And it wasn't until, maybe a year into my development, when I then moved to another circle, to a more experienced tutor, that I then began to understand that the spirit world work with all of our senses, and they may work with one or all of them at different times. So for me, naturally I am clairaudient and claircognizant. So that means I hear the spirit world and I just know things and I don't know why I know them. And it makes sense to me that growing up from a young age, I learned to play violin from the age of 4, and I'm a singer, and I come from a very musical family. So listening comes naturally to me. And so it makes absolute sense to me that naturally I'm clairaudient.
Well, thank you.
And then,
Sorry, I was just saying thank you. Yes, please carry on.
Yeah. So just through time, the spirit world then came in and developed the other senses, and it really is multifaceted. You know, they do work with each sense at different times.
Okay, thank you. What are your earliest memories of seeing or hearing spirits, please?
Well, as a child, I grew up in a working class part of Scotland on the west coast. I grew up in a shipbuilding town, and we had a very strong Irish influence in our town. So one end of the town was Catholic, the other end of the town was Protestant. And I was born into a mixed marriage, my dad being a Protestant, my mum being a Catholic. And so the earliest memory I really have is around the age of 3 or 4 of going to Mass, probably around 4 actually, of going to Mass with my mother's mother. And I would be sitting in the front looking at the altar, and I could see a woman on one side of Jesus on the cross, and I could see a young baby boy on the other side. And I thought that was my Nana, my father's mother, who had died when I was 3.5. And the little boy, at first I wasn't sure who he was, but I learned later on that was my brother who had died before I was born. So I used to see lights around the priest's head as well, and I just assumed everyone else could see these things. And it wasn't till I grew up that I realised that my granny couldn't see any of that it was just unique to me.
That's very interesting. So would you say it's this type of event that started you on your spiritual path?
Well, it was one of the things, but, you know, growing up as a Catholic, we were always told it was a sin to try and communicate with the dead. And there was a lot of fear put into us that you shouldn't communicate with the other world. So it wasn't really until I was in my teens that I had a very profound dream. And that was after my maternal grandmother died. So I was 16. And I'd been having a rough time between the ages of 11 and 16. My parents had divorced, and my grandfather had died, and I was going off the rails, having problems at school, the usual teenage rebellion.
Yes.
And then my grandmother died of a heart attack when I was 16, and I had this very profound dream after her death, where I went upstairs. It was basically a mountain which had stairs going up the mountain and big Doric pillars. To me, it reminded me of something like the Parthenon or Greek mythology. And when I went upstairs to this mountain, there was a big open air ballroom. And when I looked inside, I could see my grandparents dancing with each other, and they were waving at me. But there was a bouncer on the door, interestingly. At that time, I was a teenage rebel, and I was drinking in a local pub underage. I was 16. And it was the bouncer from the local pub who was on the door. And he said to me, "I'm sorry, but you can't get in. It's not your time. You have to go back downstairs." So I waved goodbye to my grandmother and my grandfather, and I woke up with floods of tears all over my pillow. And that was the beginning of my healing after my grandmother had died. It was the beginning of me understanding that there was more to life than this life.
That's very interesting.
Yeah, and I can only say that my grandmother then became my conscience. And so when I was doing things that I shouldn't be doing as a teenage rebel, I would hear her in my mind encouraging me, telling me not to do it and encouraging me to go and do good things. So she became my guide in some sense before I really understood anything about mediumship. And over the years, I felt a massive draw to go and see a medium. And I didn't understand the difference at that time between a medium and a psychic. So I found myself in Glasgow Psychic Centre, and I had a few tarot readings, but sadly my grandmother never came through. And it wasn't until I was 27 a spiritualist church opened in my local area, and I felt an enormous pull to go and join the church. And I was invited to join the circle there, and it was then that I really fully understood mediumship and began my journey of development.
Thank you. When we spoke to organise this interview, you said you see auras, and you said you saw gold, white and yellow around my crown chakra. Do you see auras regularly?
In my conscious waking daily life, it's not something that I pay attention to very much. And the reason for that is that I feel as a medium that it's important to have a discipline and to switch your ability to communicate with the spirit world on and off. So in my normal life, when I'm dealing with my children and, you know, my daily, day-to-day mundane stuff, I really don't pay very much attention at all to spirit. But when I open up to the spirit world and I consciously set my intention to work with spirit, then I do very much become aware of what I call spirit lights. And I really do become aware of people's auras. And sometimes I see those auras, but most often I feel them from people. And I think that that's something that's inherited as well for lots of us. I think we're all capable of it. And it all depends whether or not you're open to these experiences.
So when you say that you feel them, do you sense the coloured energy? And do you usually interpret the coloured energy? Do you get feelings from those colours?
Yes, I definitely get feelings, and not always colours, but sometimes emotions. When I see it as colour, I associate it with emotions, but when I feel it as emotions. And, you know, my grandmother was a lady who could size people up instantly when she met them. And my mother does the same. And I feel that I've inherited that from a long line of people who were actually mediums and psychics, but just didn't know that they were because of the Catholic conditioning, you know?
Yes.
But certainly when I see colours around people, I definitely associate it with emotions, or sometimes I'll associate it with, for example, well, to give an example, there is one lady who used to attend my development classes. And when I first met this lady, my first instinct was that I saw blue all around this lady's head. And it was, to me, it was the colour of the Virgin Mary, because I had grown up as a Catholic. So it symbolised Mother Mary to me. And I felt her energy as very nurturing and maternal and loving and caring. And as I got to know this lady, I then discovered that she was a foster mother and that she'd been doing that for 30 years. But right away, her aura told me that. And this lady was not Catholic, but she was very spiritual. She is religious, but just not Catholic. But the blue colour brought that feeling to me, that knowledge, that knowing that she was a motherly vibration.
Very interesting. We've only got a couple of minutes left, so if in a couple of minutes you could say anything that you can about seeing or sensing spirit animals, I'd be grateful.
Certainly. An interesting story about that. When I lived alone in my 20s, I was going through a difficult time, and a cat appeared out of nowhere, and he used to follow me home. And I lived in a tenement close, and he would come up and sit in the close, and at first I didn't let him into the house, but after a few weeks I let him in, and then he gradually moved in with me. And he was a ginger tomcat, and he was my first experience of an animal in my life. And he brought so much love and so much comfort to me at a time when I was struggling with grief and the split up from a relationship. And after I moved away from that flat, I went and found the owner to say that I was moving away. And I'd called this little cat Garfield because he was ginger. I found the owner anyway, and she explained his name was actually Tigger. And she wasn't worried because she knew I was looking after him. She knew I'd been feeding him. So I moved away, and about a year and a half or 2 years later, I was doing a mediumship course through in Edinburgh. And the
We've
lady
only got
gave me
so
a
many
reading.
seconds left now, so if you could just sort of summarise. Are you saying that when he passed, you actually saw him again in spirit?
Yes, she brought him through to me, and she could feel him, and she could describe his personality. So it brought so much love to me to know that he was still alive in the spirit world.
Oh, that's excellent. The time has absolutely flown, so I'm sure we should speak again. And the